Welcome out, everyone, to week 1 of Soul Music. My name is Pastor Jeremy. I'm excited to lead the group discussion tonight. Hopefully you're gathered up watching this with your CG right now, and you guys got to attend on Sunday and hear what this first week was all about. If you were with us, you know we talked a whole lot about emotion. I love what Augustine has to say about emotion. He says that our emotions are like smoke from a fire. And if you've got smoke in your house, it's never wise to just kind of whiff it away and say, well, hopefully that's nothing, right? You want to investigate. You want to figure out what's going on. You know, if there's something that's on fire, if there's something burning. Our emotions are kind of like the check engine light of our soul. And in Psalm 44 that we discussed on Sunday morning, you know that we did a deep dive on a really emotional text. It starts out with just talking about how historically faithful God has been. The top end of Psalm 44 is really happy, is really good. You know, when you first start to read it, it's a great reminder of all the ways that God has delivered His people, ways He's been faithful to us, ways He's been faithful in the past. But then there's a little bit of a gear change, right? And it starts to feel really heavy towards the end. But I want to spend some time talking about the front end of that text right now, just the historical faithfulness of God. While you're gathered up in your group right now, I think it'd be great for you guys to read a little bit about the first few verses of Psalm 44 and to remind yourself about how faithful God has been. While you guys are gathered up, maybe take a moment here to pause the video to talk about how faithful God has been over the last year, maybe the last 5 years, the last decade. What are some things that look like some mountains or some dead ends in the road that you thought, man, there is certainly no way we are going to be able to press through this, and yet God found a way for you to make it forward. Why don't you take some time right now to pause the video and talk as a group about how faithful God has been over the years. And now as you guys pick back up, if you venture into the text a little further, you start to see again that gear shift that we talked about as David starts to really illustrate for us how difficult it can be whenever you don't have a prayer that's answered. He starts to kind of melt down into emotion, right? There's a portion of the text where he literally starts to indict God. He says, look, we've been faithful on our end, God. We've been obedient. We've followed the 5-step program. We've done everything you've asked for, and yet you've not come through in the way that you promised. Now, I want to ask you this for a second, and I hope that this gets the gears in your head turning. But when's the last time you prayed with that kind of honesty? You know, don't we tend to sort of put this shiny veneer on our prayers? Like, we don't always feel like we can be super honest with God. If you've got an issue, you know, it's not that it could be God's fault a lot of times, right? He's perfect. He's God. The issue must fall on our end. But if we're really honest with ourselves, it's really normal to feel frustrated in the Christian walk when you've got a desire, when you've got something you've prayed for, when you've got something that you've sought God after and yet have not seen an answer for. It can be really frustrating. And Psalm 44 causes us to remember, causes again those wheels to turn in our head a little bit to help us to understand that it's not just normal for us to experience this kind of frustration in life, but I also think that God expects us to run to Him whenever we feel like there's some kind of dissonance here. God, you promised one thing, and yet my reality is another. Why don't you take a second here in your group to discuss some of those contrasts that you felt in the Christian walk? You know, what is something that you feel like God has called you towards or God has placed in your heart as a desire, and yet your reality looks a little bit different? Take some time as a group right now to talk a little bit about how those things don't exactly add up, and yet you're still trusting God for your future. And finally, I think it would be great as you take a look at the very last end of this passage, you see that there's really no resolution. I think it'd be great to just spend a little bit of time touching on this here, but you know, a lot of times in the Christian walk, we tend to just make things really flowery and put a silver lining on everything and just say, okay, if it's not panning out the way that I feel like it should, or if things aren't going the way that I want them to, well, God has a plan, and God's going to take care of me. And that's certainly true. God does have a plan, and Romans tells us that God is going to work all things out for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. Those are true things. But sometimes the reality of life just feels a little heavier than that. Like, sometimes doesn't it feel like those sort of trite truths belong on a bumper sticker and they're not always helpful when you're in the present reality? There's no resolution at the end of Psalm 44. And I think that tells us something here, that sometimes it's okay to be honest to God, and sometimes it's okay to not get all the answers that we feel like we need. Sometimes what God wants for us is maybe not to have the answers in the moment, but instead to trust him right there at the end of our own personal Psalm 44, wherever we're at. And so again, why don't you take this time as a group to just pray over the things that you're seeking resolution from God over. And if he doesn't provide an immediate answer, maybe float some things out to your group right now that we can remember in the days ahead to be praying over. And as you guys wrap up tonight, my prayer for you would be that you would be encouraged ultimately at the end of this psalm. It's okay to be honest with God. It's okay that there's not always a rosy, flowery ending in this world, because in the world to come, God has things totally worked out for us. He's made a home, he's made a path, and he's made a way. Ultimately, things resolve. But I believe what the psalmist says, that we're going to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. So there's always something to hope towards. So right now, wherever you're at watching, again, my prayer for you is that you've been encouraged by this, that you guys have been enriched by the discussion. And in the days ahead, I hope that God richly blesses you all. We love you. We're going to see you guys here next week.